Hello, I'm Adam Watson at Watson EdTech, and this is the Blended Learning Basics video series. We are actually going to have video number 4, which is going to discuss the SAMR model. And so for our learning targets that we've introduced at the beginning of our video series, we're on to number 3 and number 4. At the end of this video, you should be able to describe the SAMR model and be able to explain why the SAMR model is important in a one-to-one environment. So let's just jump into it. Let's talk about SAMR. SAMR is an acronym for Substitution, Augmentation, Modification, and Redefinition. And basically SAMR is a tool for analyzing and reflecting on the depth of tech integration in learning. How deeply is that tech integration? How meaningfully is the tech integration occurring in the classroom learning experience? Looking at it as far as from S to R, let's break down each of these levels and talk briefly about what they mean and some examples of what that might look like in a classroom experience. So down here at the bottom, we're going to look at substitution, where the substitution, the tech acts as a direct tool substitute with no functional change. The technology is basically a low-level swap out. There's little, if any, positive difference over an analog, non-digital version of this. So let me give you a perfect example of this. A teacher may use a PowerPoint, for example, instead of using an overhead projector, which I've been around in education now for my first year of teaching. I actually did use an overhead projector. Using a PowerPoint doesn't really change the teacher-centered pedagogy that we're talking about. It's still, a person standing up there doing a direct instruction lecture, let's say. But there's some nominal improvements that happen when we do the substitution move. For example, a PowerPoint is much easier to make and edit than doing overhead slides. Certainly less messy with all that ink on your hands, right? Electronic sharing is not possible with overhead transparencies, but with a PowerPoint, you could simply upload it somewhere and it could be viewed and downloaded whenever the student would like to be able to get to it. So it's those nominal things that doesn't really make a functional difference in what happens, but it's nominal of an improvement enough where at least the substitution move is justified. Next, we go up a level to augmentation. And so this is when technology adds new features that noticeably improves the task. You have what is considered a functional improvement for that particular move to technology. Now, this still tends to be more teacher than student-centered. An example of this might be doing a Kahoot, giving students a Kahoot. Now, Kahoots are fun, they're interactive, they're game-like. It's definitely a functional improvement, though, because Kahoot is a gamified assessment. It can automatically grade whether the students are getting each question right or wrong. At the end, it provides exportable data for the teacher. So again, some teacher-centered work there, but that data is important and helpful. But in the end of the day, Kahoot is still just a multiple choice quiz. It's more engaging. It allows faster feedback than you would do if you had a paper and pencil version of that quiz. But it's a functionally improved multiple choice quiz, which is where we're at. Now we hit the dashed line here, and that really is a crossing the threshold moment in SAMR. Up to this point, you are enhancing the teaching and learning through technology. But another way that I also point out for people that are trying to learn what side of the fence they're on, whether they're on the MR or the SA, at this level, if the internet or electricity went out, you would still be able to manage. You know what, we were going to do a Kahoot, but here I can pull out some way that we can do a multiple choice quiz and still continue on with the lesson at hand. Once we cross this threshold, however, things change. Without that internet access, without electricity, you would probably have to put off the lesson for the following day. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate that lesson in an analog way. That's what happens when we're crossing that threshold. So let's look at the M for modification. At this point, tech allows for a significant task redesign. You're also creating a situation where you're going to a more student-centered environment. No internet, electricity, like I said, would make it extremely difficult. And a great example of a tool that would change that environment is the idea of a Google Doc. Now, Google Doc has the ability that you can do synchronous or asynchronous collaboration on that. Multiple students can work on it. They can give comments, give feedback, can edit words. All that is something that is a significant task redesign. But keep in mind, if all Google Docs were just an opportunity to type up an essay, that's no different than Microsoft Word or typewriter for that matter. And you're down here on the substitution level. But the modification level, the way we're using Google Docs is a way to collaborate digitally and so on. That's creating an opportunity that allows it to be a modification kind of move. Last but not least, we have redefinition. And that is where tech allows for the creation of new tasks that were previously inconceivable. That's a good phrase there to keep in mind. But also, in addition to that, it's the peak of integration because it's often where students are the most creative and innovative. And the thing that I like to point out and use for this definition a lot is that they're impacting the outside world. Because of digital technology, they are able to experience and interact with people, publish and share with people outside of the four walls of their classroom. An example might be, say, some middle school students in America, they decide to make a Google slide that's an English alphabet book where they have embedded videos that they filmed and they've made. So they're creating that material in these Google slides, each slide being a letter of the alphabet. And they've done this with an end goal in mind of sharing this with students in Mexico, perhaps a classroom and a teacher that both the American and the Mexican teacher have made arrangements to share and collaborate and interact in this way. So redefinition, a previously inconceivable impacting the outside world, is important. And we're in these two levels, we're definitely in a transformation level of how technology is changing the classroom environment. In addition to that, we want to point out that students are coming or transitioning from a consumer level of merely being passive content people who are just simply passively looking at or perhaps viewing the information or interacting with it on a low-level way, to that students are on a creator level where they're actually making stuff. And that's a transition that happens at some point as we cross this threshold from SA to M&R. Also, as we pointed out a few times along the way, the lower levels, the S and A, substitution and augmentation, tend to be more teacher-centered. Whereas as we go up to the upper levels of modification, redefinition, you start seeing more student agency and more of a student-centered learning environment. So it's not necessarily one for one. It's just the tendency that you see as you shift and go on this spectrum of SAMR for the SAMR. Now, I want to really hammer home the idea that SAMR is a way of looking at the learning experience, and it's not just the tool. I mentioned briefly the Google Doc example, that a Google Doc could just be a way to type up an essay, which would be a low-level use of that technology, or more of a collaborative experience, which changes how we'd look at it through the lens of SAMR. And I want to use the example of Skype that I personally had experience with me in the classroom to hammer that point home. So I had one of the first generations of interactive flat panel TVs with a little camera built into it in the last few years that I was a teacher. And with that experience, I really wanted to use Skype, which was relatively new at that time. And I thought, what a great way of creating that experience and having something different in the learning of our classroom. So the first time I used Skype, I used it in a class where I had a person that was at a museum who I arranged to come in and Skype at a certain moment in time and talk to the class. And they prepared a PowerPoint and they came on, and basically it was very boring. And that was my fault. I didn't give them enough guidance and structure to tell them what I wanted. It was the first time I ever tried to Skype. But the bottom line is this experience with Skype was just something that we could have just hit play on a DVD or a Blu-ray player or a VCR, a recorded lecture, if you will, and the experience would have been the same. It was passive. The students didn't have any interaction opportunities, and therefore the fact that it was Skype, it didn't really make it very transformative at all. At best, it was probably a substitution level of SAMR. On the other hand, I tried again. I did it with a little bit more foresight and planning. And we Skyped with the best-selling author of a book that we had read in class. We had prepared some questions. We had some opportunities that when we were talking to them to be more interactive back and forth. And with that, it was a much better example of integrating technology in a transformative way. I won't say it was redefinition. It was at least augmentation. It was a functional improvement of what would have happened had we had just hit play. We know it was more interactive. You might even say modification in the ways that video and audio combined created an experience that, for example, if you just phoned in, it was better than just that. So again, Skype itself isn't good, bad, or indifferent. It's not SAMR in and of itself. It's the way it's used that would help determine where it falls in the SAMR spectrum. I really love this diagram for the SAMR swimming pool Because one of the things that this establishes for us is that we don't want to be too judgmental about SAMR and think that, well, my goodness, if I live in the S world, then I must be a bad teacher. Well, that's not necessarily true, because really the idea of it is it's about your learning objectives. There are days where people just need to type up an essay, and so using a Google Doc for that purpose is absolutely fine. The key thing is that we just want to make sure that an experience for students, that we don't just stay in one side of the pool, that we experience some opportunities to cross that threshold and swim laps, as the diagram says, between substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition, that we try to get transformative at least every now and then. But the reality for a teacher is that you need to make sure that you know your supports, your instructional coaches, your digital learning coaches, your digital learning coordinator. You need to know those people that can provide opportunities to help you in the hows and the whys of that technology. But the second part is that when you get into the water, make sure that you're swimming laps. To live in the world of redefinition, where you're constantly collaborating with a Mexican classroom and creating materials for their students of English alphabet, slides and all that kind of stuff, well, that's a great experience. It's probably too ambitious to think you're going to do that every day of the week, 5 days a week, every week for 9 months. There are moments where you're going to have those redefinition opportunities at the end of a PBL and so on. But there's as many opportunities where there's some day-to-day that you might just be absolutely fine for doing substitution or augmentation moves with technology. And that's okay. Again, the idea is just to swim laps. Wherever we're at, just try not to stay in that one area and try to stretch yourself every now and then as far as to get more transformative with technology. When you're thinking about, say, a lesson plan or the use of a tool, and you're thinking to yourself, well, is this S, A, M, or R? This diagram I really love. It's a great way of asking one big question that figures out where you might fall. So, for example, what will I gain by replacing the task with new tech? If you have nothing to gain, then you probably shouldn't use the technology. But if you have a nominal improvement, right, think about the PowerPoint over the overhead projector, then you're probably at the substitution level. If you can answer this question in a positive way, does a tech add new features that improves the task? Well, then, friends and neighbors, you might be at the level of augmentation. Now that you cross this threshold, if you can answer this question of, does the task significantly change with the use of technology? Well, if there's a significant change, then you're probably in the area of modification. And again, once we cross this threshold, this invisible dotted line, we're in an area where if the internet or technology, if the electricity goes out, you would be difficult, if not impossible, to reproduce this lesson. And last but not least, does a tech allow for creation of a new task previously inconceivable? If it's previously inconceivable, and especially if it impacts people outside of the four walls of a classroom, then you are probably at the level of redefinition. And to give credit where credit's due, that diagram and set of questions came from this D56 Tech Trek.weebly.com website, which is a professional development offshoot of the Gurney District 56 in Illinois. So I want to give credit where credit's due. That was when I experienced this website, I was like, aha, that's a great way of trying to break that down. If I'm doing a SAMR analysis of where I fall, where those 4 questions help lead me to that discovery. So on that note, speaking of questions, let's look at a reflection question as we end this video. On the average day, where does your instruction usually fall, S, A, M, or R, and how do you know? Again, not in a judgmental way, but if you had to pick an average, where might you be in that level of SAMR for deeper use of technology integration? Now we'll leave you with a video here on the video. I want to give you some examples, 4 different examples of classroom instruction that utilize some technology. And I want you to think about, is it an S, A, M, or R? Before I do that, again, giving credit where credit's due, these examples came from a professional development opportunity I had several years ago. I traveled to Mooresville Graded School District, which is in North Carolina. And the reason that Mooresville has some clout is that they have been doing laptops with students in a one-to-one environment for years, when back way before most of us even scrambled with the idea, before Chromebooks were invented and whatnot. They have a lot of experience to bring to the table, and they have shared that on an annual basis in a summer connection professional development. And I've had the opportunity to actually go twice to Mooresville. Lots of positive things I can say about learning from their processes and things that they've done. But in that note, they were talking about SAMR in a professional development session, and they had a multitude of different examples that give people an opportunity to learn and analyze. I'm going to provide 4. I'm not going to provide the answers. We'll leave on that cliffhanging moment for you to think about as we go into our last video, and then we'll come back with our answers. So here's example 1. Students select a topic within Roman history that they would like to research further. Students create a multimedia presentation for the class to teach them about their topic and provide the class a link to their presentation so each student can more deeply explore and interact with the content further. This is example number 1. Example 2. Students create an electronic form to find out favorite pastimes of students in their Spanish class. Example 3. Students research a historical concept and create a children's literature version of it. Students collaborate with the younger grade level to compile illustrations and audio narratives for the electronic book and make the book available to share with parents in the community. And last, example 4. Students use a multimedia Shakespeare book that includes a video performance alongside each page of text. So, think about those 4 examples. Think about whether it's a substitution, augmentation, modification, or redefinition. And we'll come back at the beginning of our next video to analyze the answers and results. Thanks so much for listening.